As day turns to night, the people of New Orleans take shelter in their houses away from the soulless, human-like figures who are on the hunt for their next human sacrifice. New Orleans has a history of vampires luring humans into the darkness to feed off of their blood. I'm Crystal, and this is Everything is Spooky in the Dark. Today's podcast ventures into the world of vampire lore in New Orleans. In France, vampire stories date back as far as the 1700s, so it's no wonder that with the French colonialists coming to the shores of what is now the United States, they would bring their vampire stories and their vampires along with them. One such person was the Count of Saint-Germain. He was an incredibly skilled man who was able to speak 6 languages and was a magnificent piano and violin player. He was a great conversationalist, and he had immense knowledge of history and the world. He was unbelievably wealthy, so much so that he was known for carrying gems in his pockets. But his life was mysterious. No one knew anything about him, his family, or where he came from. One thing that made people feel uneasy was that Saint-Germain didn't seem to age. Many years later in New Orleans, a man with a similar name, Jacques Saint-Germain, arrived, and he too was shrouded in mystery. This man quickly gained popularity in New Orleans due to his charisma and charm, and would often have lavish parties with food and wine. The strange thing about Saint-Germain was that he would never partake in eating any of the food. He was only ever seen sipping his wine while he held conversations with his magnetism. One night, rumor has it, that a woman lingered after one of the parties, and Jacques was seen trying to bite her neck out in the moonlight off his balcony. However, much to his dismay, the woman escaped and told the police what he had done. It was too late. Jacques Saint-Germain was nowhere to be seen. All he left behind were hundreds of bottles of wine. But when the police officers examined the wine, they discovered it was mixed with human blood. People say that they have seen Saint-Germain lurking in the shadows long after his supposed death in 1784. Could he have slipped away from the mortal world as he was almost caught? Or is he spending his nights in a place that has not yet suspected that he may be immortal? Saint-Germain isn't the only suspicious tale of vampires lingering around the cobbled streets of New Orleans. If you have walked past the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans, you may be unaware that it was once home to vampires. When French colonialists moved to New Orleans, the population was mostly men. To help New Orleans continue growing, the men needed wives. They reached out to King Louis for help. The king sent girls and women from convents in France to New Orleans for marriage. When the girls arrived, they were pale and gaunt, and their skin turned red quickly from the sun. Each of these girls came with a coffin-like suitcase that held their belongings. This is how they got their name, the Casket Girls. Rumor says that when these girls arrived, the mortality rate went up in New Orleans, especially the death of infants. The girls were sent to Ursuline Convent until they were married off. Once the girls moved into the convent, people would say that the attic's shutters would fly open on New Orleans' misty nights. The stories of the Casket Girls continue to live on in New Orleans, and 2 men were said to have broken into the convent to search for signs that the tales were true. The moment they walked into the attic, they knew the Casket Girls were real vampires. Sitting among the dust were hundreds of coffin-shaped suitcases, nailed shut to prevent the vampire girls from claiming more victims. If you want to hear the real truth behind the legend of the Casket Girls, I highly recommend you check out my podcast, episode number 1, called The Casket Girls of New Orleans. I wonder how many men the girls turned during their time living in New Orleans. Because a woman in the 1930s escaped an apartment with her wrists sliced open. She had blood running down her arm as she rushed to the police. When the police arrived at the apartment to investigate, it was empty, except that several people were tied to chairs with their wrists cut open, and their blood was draining slowly but steadily from their bodies. In addition to those still alive, over a dozen bodies were completely drained of their blood. John and Wayne Carter were the brothers who lived in this apartment. Both men lived and worked in the French Quarter. Stories say that the Carter brothers abducted people from the dark streets of New Orleans in the night to hold them captive and drink their blood for days. Police were finally able to find the Carter brothers, but it took 8 officers to hold them down to apprehend them. John and Wayne Carter were responsible for the horror, and to pay for their crimes, they were executed, and their dead bodies were put in their family's vault in a nearby cemetery. Usually when a body is buried within a vault, the hot summer air in New Orleans slowly cremates the bodies and they turn into ash and bone. These remains are pushed back into the vault, reconnecting with the earth when the body of a newly deceased family member is buried within the tomb. Shockingly, when the vault was opened, the bodies of John and Wayne were missing. How could their bodies be missing? Could they be vampires as well? There have been many sightings of Wayne and John walking in the streets of the French Quarter over the years. The fear of vampires was so strong that for a time in New Orleans, family members would stay with their deceased loved ones until burial so they could be sure the corpses would not turn into vampires. Nowadays, real vampires still walk the streets of New Orleans. These vampire communities are all around the city, and they do drink real human blood, but from consenting participants. New Orleans vampires throw lavish vampire balls and get-togethers that are both incredible and possibly terrifying from an outsider's perspective. I think it's pretty cool though. If mingling with real vampires isn't your thing, but you still love the history and stories behind these supernatural creatures, you can visit one of the many locations around New Orleans that have vampire-related lore and history, such as the newly opened Vampire Cafe, the Bourbon Orleans Hotel where some of the Casket Girls stayed, to the Vampire Boutique in the French Quarter. I also recommend visiting a jazz bar on Bourbon Street named Fritzl's. In addition to the amazing jazz, there is a vampire speakeasy on the 2nd level. You can get vampire-inspired drinks while enjoying a delightful atmosphere. You do need a password to enter, which I cannot tell you as I do not want the vampires to come after me. But you can find it with a little bit of research, which makes it that much more rewarding when you finally knock on the door to be let in. Many of these stories have been embellished over the years, but the legends have to have started from somewhere. What do you think? Do you think vampires are real? And why do so many of them live in New Orleans? I love that New Orleans embraces its spooky history. Do you want to know more about the other supernatural beings that call New Orleans home? Let me know by visiting me at wanderingcrystal.com or leaving me a comment on YouTube. Bye!